So if you're looking to buy a Canon mirrorless camera, chances are you're looking at either the Canon R5 or R6. Now, I use both of these cameras in combination, so I know the ins and outs of both cameras. I know which camera I often reach for more often than not, and I also know which camera I often recommend to others. Spoiler alert, they're not actually the same camera. To give you a bit more background about me, I've been using the R5 literally since it came out, and I then added the R6 a little while after to my kit. I've used them both for all sorts of photography, from weddings to street photography, landscape, portrait. So video wise, I use them both for client work. I've shot a few weddings with them, but generally I mostly use them for this YouTube channel. On paper, you'll find a number of differences in these cameras, some of which to me really aren't that noticeable in the real world. But overall, I'm going to only give a point to either camera for anything that really stands out as a key difference, things that actually matter when you're using these cameras, as points will be weighted differently depending on you and what's important to you. Stay to the end where I will give an overall summary and look at these key differences, ultimately so you can decide which one's right for you. Let's jump in. So firstly, looking at size and appearance. So these cameras are pretty much identical in size, but we do have the R5 just slightly heavier. For some people, this extra weight is actually nice to counter some heavier lenses, but overall, 58 grams one way or another isn't enough of a noticeable difference to really give me a point to one camera either way. Personally, in hand, I probably prefer the R5, but this could actually just be because it looks a little bit nicer with the extra top screen instead of the wheel. I know some people actually prefer this wheel though, so again, not enough to give a point either way. Also on appearance, taking a quick look at the LCD screen and also the viewfinder, the R5 clearly wins on paper with a much higher resolution on both and also a slightly bigger LCD screen. However, the R6, well, it's still more than good enough in my opinion. Don't think for most people is really enough to consider one camera over the other. So again, no points here, but consider what is important to you. Next up, looking at image quality. And in this category, we do have a clear winner, and that ultimately comes down to a higher resolution. The R5, you will get much more detail in your images, as you would obviously expect. It also gives you the ability to really crop in on your photos, and also allows you to actually shoot in a times 1.6 crop mode that almost gives you the same detail as the R6, which is a really nice feature when wanting that little extra reach, especially with any telephoto lenses. That in mind, for a large percentage of people, I do think 20 megapixels is actually more than enough if you do want to blow up your images larger. There's even technology like Adobe's super resolution that seems to work pretty well when you do need it. Also here, keep in mind the much larger files you're getting from the 45 megapixel R5. For some people, this could actually mean a bit of a win to the R6. But for me, just because of the options it does provide, here, of course, I'm giving a point to the R5. Next up, we have price. Here, I'm not only looking at the overall price, but also the value for money. Now, of course, there's a clear winner here, and that is definitely the R6. In USD, you're looking at around 3,800 for the R5 and only about 2.5 for the R6. A price difference that really just isn't worth it for a lot of people. If you also want to get the most out of the R5, remember you are going to need a CF card that isn't cheap either. This is required for both 4K at 120 frames per second and also 8K. It will also increase the number of shots you can shoot on burst mode. So for overall price and value for money, I do think the R6 makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. So that's a point to the R6. Next up, we have two categories that don't really differ too much, so I'll run through them quite quickly. That is the autofocus and also the burst mode capabilities. So autofocus, we pretty much have the same systems, and honestly, after using both cameras, I haven't found any differences with the R5 and R6. They both have really amazing AF systems that are a huge step up from anything I've used previously and will really hit the mark for pretty much all shooters, which leaves not much else to say on this category. And again, no points to either camera. In terms of burst modes, again, kudos to Canon because they haven't deliberately crippled the R6 in this category. With both cameras, you'll get 12 frames per second with the mechanical or first curtain shutter, and then 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. That said, I have looked at a few tests and you'll actually get longer burst rates from the R6. But notably here, the number of shots you can still get on the R5 with such large files is actually really crazy, and I can't think of a situation where you're going to need more. So again, no obvious points to either camera here. Moving on to the card slots, and there are some key differences here, but these differences will largely come down to the individual. Yes, the CF card slot in the R5 allows you to shoot these huge files in burst mode for a long time, shoot 8K and even shoot 4K at 120 frames per second. But actually having two SD slots in the R6 is probably a big win for most people, to be honest, because you're going to save money and you don't have to carry two different types of cards around with you. Again, I'm not going to give a clear winner here as it will ultimately depend on the user. Moving on to ISO and low light performance. So in this category, again, we have a clear winner, and surprise, surprise, with its lower megapixel count, this is actually the R6. Without pushing the ISO to crazy numbers, for such a high resolution camera, the R5 actually performs really well. But from watching many tests of this, it is clear that the R6 does win at those higher ISOs. So here the R6 is the winner, but consider whether you use your camera in those high ISO situations. You might shoot mostly in a studio at low ISOs, then it's not going to matter at all to you. But just for that capability, here I'm going to give a point to the R6. Moving on to image stabilization, and both cameras do have the same system. So again, no points to have a clear winner here. Definitely having that inbuilt image stabilization is a really nice addition to both these cameras. Moving on to battery life, and again, actually the R6, because the R5 is so powerful, you're going to get more shots out of your R6 than your R5. If this is super important to you, often people will use a battery grip anyway. Perhaps if you don't want to use one, you will get about 40 extra shots on the R6. Yes, this is nice to have, but for me, using both cameras, I haven't really noticed much of a difference, to be honest, just from day-to-day use. So I'm not going to give a point here to either camera. Moving on to weather sealing and build quality. Now, the R5 is slightly sturdier built, which you won't really notice holding them in hand. They both feel really well built and sturdy, and they both do have weather sealing. Looking at the weather sealing, I have read articles tearing apart the R5, and the weather sealing is actually really good. The R5 is more on par with the old 5D line, while the R6 is more in line with the last 6D. So overall, I obviously have no data here of my own. I'm not going to throw my cameras into water to find out, but I have used both in rainy conditions with no issues. But just because it's meant to have slightly better weather sealing and a slightly stronger build quality, here I will give a point to the R5. Taking a quick look at overall reliability and also overheating. Now, both of these cameras are super reliable, there's no questions there. And if you're shooting just stills, overheating is nothing you even need to consider. For me, as a hybrid shooter living here in Sydney, but also traveling around a little bit, the overheating has never actually been an issue on either camera for me, even shooting video. I think this is only going to be a big issue for you if you shoot really long form content or shooting 8K or really smashing the 120 frames per second 4K. Maybe if you're in a really hot environment, I can't see this being an issue for you. Keep in mind that the R5, you can actually shoot the regular 4K footage unlimited by overheating. This only becomes an issue when you put it into the high quality 4K mode or shoot at these higher frame rates or 8K. The R6, on the other hand, it does overheat in its regular 4K mode if you shoot for long enough. So here, because you can have that option to shoot unlimited 4K on the R5, I'm going to have to give a point to this camera. All right, moving on to video now before we wrap up and look at a summary. And this is where the R5 starts to stand out a little bit more. So firstly, looking at video modes and video options. The R5 does give you more shooting options with both IPB and all-eye compression options, which will be important to some people. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, maybe it's not important to you, but keep in mind, this can also depend on your computer, as some may have issues reading the more compressed files. With the R6, you only get this compressed IPB files, so this may be an issue for some people depending on how you're editing. Obviously, we also get 8K capabilities on the R5, plus we get 4K at 120 frames per second. 8K for me, I'm not really using, but 4K 120 I do use a lot of. So the R6 has a max out of 4K at 60 frames per second, but you do get 120 frames per second in 1080, which is still nice to have. But here again, that's another clear point to the R5. So my last video point is probably the main reason I actually pick up the R5 over the R6 whenever I'm shooting video. And I haven't heard too many people talk about this, and that is actually the ability to use custom video modes. Because the mode setup is totally different on the R5, you do have the option to set up your custom saved video modes, which I have set up at 4K, 25, 50, and 100 frames per second, all ready to go with the right shutter speed. Honestly, this saves so much time. And once you've had it there, to go back to a camera without it, it is really quite frustrating. You can still use custom modes for photo on the R6, but personally, I mostly only use these custom modes when it comes to video. So that's another small win, but another point to the R5. All right, so let's take a look at these final results, and more importantly, how these results may affect you. We have the R5 clearly on top, but again, we need to weigh up that these points that I have given out may not have equal weight depending on what's important to you. If we look at these results before we got to video, it was actually really even to me. The R6 winning on value for money and low light performance, while the R5 stands out really for its larger resolution and possibly for some better weather sealing. So if you're looking at these cameras mostly for photography, it really comes down to price versus megapixels. And this is why for such a large percentage of people, I actually recommend the R6 over the R5. If you are a hybrid shooter, much like myself, this is definitely where I'm going to recommend the R5. If both cameras are there and I know I'm shooting video, well, I always pick up the R5. But again, really consider how important these extra video options are for you. A lot of people don't need 8K. A lot of people don't even need 4K 120. So perhaps the R6 may still be the better option for you. All right, thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe to the channel. I hope this video was useful and you've made your decision. I don't think you'll be too disappointed either way. Keep on creating and keep on growing, my friends. I will catch you in the next one. Bye for now.